Welcome, traveler. You've just stepped into a story that America tried to bury. Tonight, we're opening the case of a town that vanished not slowly, but all at once. They said the town disappeared overnight. Not burned, not erased, just gone. In January of 1923, a light flickered through the pine woods of Levy County, Florida. A single lantern glowing in the mist, somewhere between rumor and truth. Those who still whisper the story say it belonged to a man named Sylvester Carrier, a quiet carpenter, a musician, and a son of Rosewood. The sound of his footsteps vanished long before the smoke did. Rosewood was a small, self-sufficient black town on the Gulf Coast, no more than 24 families, proud, rooted, and careful with their peace. By day, the children carried books to a one-room schoolhouse. By night, hymns rose from the wooden church that stood at the center of everything. They believed they had found refuge, a place where the world beyond the pines could not reach. But the world did reach. The newspapers called it a disturbance. Historians later called it a massacre. The survivors called it a silence that lasted 70 years. And yet even silence leaves echoes. It began with a scream from a nearby white town. A woman claimed she'd been attacked. No one saw who did it. No evidence, no witness. But within hours, the rumor had a name, a face, and a direction: Rosewood. By dusk, armed men gathered under the Spanish moss. By midnight, the first homes were surrounded. By morning, the church bell rang, only once before its steeple crumbled into flame. And in the middle of that chaos, someone held a lantern. Witnesses later said the light didn't flicker, not even when the smoke rose thick enough to hide the stars. They swore they saw Sylvester standing by his mother's window, holding that lantern like a shield, calling for the children to run toward the swamp road, toward the sound of the train whistle. But the train never stopped. Not that night, not for them. Years later, when investigators returned to what remained of Rosewood, they found only fragments, nails half buried in sand, a broken fiddle, the rusted frame of a lantern. No census record, no postmark, no gravestone with a date after January 1923. It was as if the land itself had swallowed the memory. And yet if you stand there today, under those same pines, some say, you can still hear the faint rhythm of a hammer striking wood. Like a carpenter refusing to stop his work. Maybe it's the wind. Maybe it's history trying to finish a story that was never allowed to end. Before we begin, take a breath. Look around wherever you are right now, your room, your street, your quiet space. Now imagine it gone by morning, erased not by time, but by anger. That was Rosewood. And tonight, we are going back there. Through the records and the rumors, through the testimonies that took 70 years to surface, through the silence that tried to bury the truth. Because history doesn't disappear. It just waits under the ashes, beneath the roots, behind the names erased from ledgers. This is not just the story of a town. It is the story of a disappearance, engineered, denied, and almost forgotten. The story of how memory survives when every trace of it is meant to die. So before we begin, leave a comment where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Because time matters here. In 1923, the clock stopped for Rosewood, and they never quite started again. Listen closely. Every word you're about to hear was once buried by history. January 1923. Florida's Gulf Coast still breathed with fog and salt. The mornings came heavy, slow, as if the sun itself hesitated to rise over the longleaf pines. Rosewood sat tucked between the marshes and the railway. A small town, easy to miss if you blinked while the train passed. To the north, Gainesville with its brick stores and white porches. To the south, the sawmills of Sumner, where the air smelled of pine tar and sweat. And in between them, a place built by hands that owned almost nothing but their faith. They called it Rosewood for the color of the cedar trees, red at the heart, fragrant when cut. Every home had a porch. Every porch had a rocking chair, and every chair carried the sound of someone waiting for payday, for Sunday, for peace. The year 1923 came on quiet feet. Church bells and soft laughter carried through the woods. The people of Rosewood, men like Sylvester Carrier, Samuel Carter, the Hall brothers, they worked by the rhythm of the land. Some hauled lumber for the mills, others repaired wagons, others farmed the thin soil between the palmetto roots. In the evenings they gathered at Sarah Carrier's house, Sylvester's mother. She played the organ at the church. He tuned his violin by ear. The hymns floated out of the windows into the night air, mingling with the rustle of pine needles and the crackle of lantern oil. It was the kind of music that made people believe they were safe. But safety was a fragile thing, especially here, especially then. The world outside Rosewood was loud with warnings. Across the South, the newspapers spoke of race of boundaries, of lines that should not be crossed. Lynchings were not rare stories, they were columns tucked between the weather and the stock market. And the people of Rosewood read them, quietly, folding the papers before their children could see. Still, life went on because it had to. There was laundry to wash fields, to tend roofs, to patch after the storms. The women sewed late into the night dresses from flour sacks, curtains from old feed bags. The men repaired the church roof every summer, hammer by hammer, nail by nail, as if rebuilding it might keep the world from breaking in. And on New Year's Day, the bell at that church rang bright and clear, a sound that carried all the way to the swamp edge. People said it was good luck, a way to call in a better year. No one knew it was the last time that bell would ever ring. There's a photograph, or maybe just a memory, of that morning. Children running barefoot through dew, chasing the freight train as it clattered by. The engineer waved through a handful of candy from his window. Smoke hung in the air, soft, harmless, like a cloud that forgot to move on. And behind them the grown-ups laughed, small laughter, the kind people make when they've forgotten their troubles for a moment. But even laughter can sound like a countdown, when history is holding its breath. The train whistle, long, low, and distant, carried news from the outside world. Florida was changing. Prohibition had turned quiet towns into smuggling routes. Turpentine camps swallowed forests whole. And along every railway resentment traveled faster than the trains. By the early 1920s, Levy County was divided not just by color, but by fear. White workers in Sumner accused the lumber company of hiring too many colored men. Politicians in Gainesville whispered about Negro prosperity as though it were a threat. And in Rosewood, behind every sermon, behind every hymn, there was an unspoken rule: don't draw attention. Don't let them remember we're here. But people can't help being seen when they build something beautiful. The gardens in Rosewood were full collard greens, corn peach trees heavy with fruit. The schoolhouse glowed with chalk dust and the smell of lamp oil. Evenings were for storytelling elders, sitting by the fire telling children how their parents had once walked barefoot out of slavery and built this place from nothing. That pride, that simple pride of survival, was enough to make some people angry. History has a way of punishing joy when it belongs to the wrong skin. The local sheriff, Robert Elias Walker, was a name everyone knew, but seldom spoke. He passed through Rosewood sometimes, riding slow eyes sweeping over the porches. He wasn't cruel, not the way others were, but he carried the kind of power that needed no words. His silence could mean anything. Or everything. By January 1st, 1923, the air itself felt strange, as if something was waiting just beyond the tree line. The pines creaked more than usual. Dogs barked at nothing. And in the Carrier home, Sarah noticed her son staying up later than usual, pacing, sanding the handle of an old hammer, setting the lantern by the window. He said he was fixing something for the church. But maybe, just maybe, he felt it coming. Every tragedy starts like a whisper. Every disappearance begins with someone looking the other way. When the sun rose on that first day of the new year, it shone on clean porches, fresh-washed sheets, and the quiet pride of a town that still believed tomorrow would look like today. In the fields, children chased fireflies left over from the night before. In the swamp, frogs croaked like an old gospel rhythm. And somewhere far down the rail, a train whistle blew 3 short bursts like a warning no one could translate. To the people of Rosewood, it was just another morning. A morning full of promise, of small routines, of human warmth. They didn't know that within a week their homes would be cinders, that their names would vanish from the county rolls. That history would call them ghosts. All they knew in that brief window between peace and fire was that life was ordinary. And sometimes, the most dangerous thing in history is an ordinary day that doesn't know it's about to end. When history goes missing, it doesn't vanish, it hides. And sometimes it hides in plain sight. The official records of Levy County 1923 begin with a single sentence typed uneven, faint from age, disturbance in the colored settlement near Sumner. Property loss unknown. That's all it said. No names, no deaths, just property loss. But dig deeper, and you start to see the cracks between the words. A sheriff's logbook mentions a mob proceeding to Rosewood after dark. A telegraph from the governor's office advises a calm, situation volatile. A note from a local undertaker, 3 unclaimed bodies, identity uncertain, and then silence. It was as if the paper trail itself was afraid. But survivors, the ones who lived to tell it decades later, they remembered. Their memories were not tidy paragraphs. They were fragments, whispers, trembling voices caught in old recordings. In one of the WPA oral histories recorded in the 1930s, a woman named Minnie Lee Langley said, "Mama told me to run. She said, 'Don't look back, baby.' But I did. I saw fire and I saw the lantern in the window. It wasn't moving no more." Another voice, Roby Morton, one of the last known survivors, said she was 7 years old when the world turned red. All I could hear was the train. But it didn't stop. I think about that whistle every night. Those interviews, decades after the fact, are all that remain of a town erased from its own county maps. And yet every sentence trembles with the weight of something larger, something no official record could carry. Folklore filled the space where documents failed. In the years after the massacre, locals began to talk about the light that wouldn't die. They called it the Rosewood Lantern. Hunters swore they saw it drifting through the pines, a soft golden glow, too low to be the moon, too steady to be a firefly. Sometimes it stayed still. Sometimes it moved toward the old road, the same road the train never stopped on. Old men in nearby Cedar Key said it was the soul of Sylvester Carrier, the carpenter still looking for the children he tried to save. Others said it was the reflection of justice that never came. But folklore, like smoke, never rises alone. It clings to what's left beneath it, the ashes of fact. In a Gainesville newspaper dated January 6, 1923, the headline read, "Negro Uprising Quelled, Sumner Restored to Order." No mention of who died, no count of the missing, no follow-up investigation. For decades, that was the story America told itself, that Rosewood was a riot, not a purge. That peace had been restored, that the burned homes and vanished families were unfortunate but unavoidable. But the truth? The truth sat buried under 70 years of polite silence. The first real investigation didn't come until 1993, when Florida's governor finally ordered a study. Historians uncovered what locals had hidden in attics and memory photographs of families smiling on porches now gone. School attendance rosters that ended abruptly after January 1923. Ledgers showing land deeds that were quietly transferred to white speculators after the smoke cleared. The numbers told one story, the voices told another. Both true, both incomplete. Folklore filled the missing pages the way grief does when facts are too fragile. In Levy County, people began saying that the swamp near the old rail line was haunted. They called it the Road of Whispers. Fishermen refused to pass it after dark. They claimed they heard hammers striking slow, steady, as if someone was still building in the dark. No one ever found the source of that sound. Sometimes a child would wander too close and come back saying they saw a man with a lantern. His shirt white in the moonlight, his face hidden by shadow. He never spoke, just lifted the lantern once and vanished. Folklore, maybe. But in towns where truth was forbidden, folklore became evidence. Even the elders of the black churches nearby kept the story alive in hymns, subtle disguised. There was one song sung in a low hum at Sunday services. Hold the light. Don't let it fade. Hold the light. Through fire and shade. No one wrote it down. It was passed from voice to voice, mother to child like an heirloom too fragile for paper. And through those verses, the people of Rosewood, or what was left of them, kept their history breathing. The official documents tell us who filed insurance claims, who moved away, who disappeared. But the folklore tells us why they stayed alive, why the story refused to die. Because memory has its own laws, its own stubbornness. When investigators interviewed elderly survivors in the 1990s, some of them paused before answering, eyes far away. One said quietly, "We don't like to talk about it. But sometimes when I dream, I'm still there, and the church light's still on." That church, the one that burned first, was never rebuilt. But its coordinates still appear faintly on old county maps. Under the satellite imagery, you can see a clearing circular, overgrown with sweet gum and moss. Locals say nothing grows right there. The soil feels hollow. In one archival photo, a faint shape hovers above the ruin's lens flare, the skeptics say. But those who've been there claim otherwise. They say the air goes still, the insects stop buzzing, and the light, that same golden light, flickers once, like an old lantern being lifted in a forgotten window. Even now, truck drivers passing Route 24 after midnight report seeing a glow in the trees. It vanishes when they slow down, appears again when they pass. Always the same height off the ground, always near where Rosewood once stood. You can dismiss folklore. You can footnote it, label it local color. But sometimes, folklore is just the soul of history still breathing after the facts have been burned. And maybe, just maybe, the truth of Rosewood exists somewhere between the two. Between the official reports typed by men who never set foot there, and the stories whispered by women who lost everything except their voices. Every generation added a new verse, a new theory, a new memory to the pile. Some say the lantern was found years later, buried in the sand near the tracks, glass cracked but unbroken. Others say it never existed at all, that the lantern was only a metaphor for defiance. But to those who still return every January to leave flowers under the pines, it doesn't matter which is true. The act of remembering, of standing there, of speaking the name Rosewood out loud, is the lantern. Every story told keeps that light alive. Every silence lets it fade. And so history asks us, which will we choose? The records or the rumors? The facts or the faith of those who remember? Maybe both. Because Rosewood, like so much of America's hidden past, cannot exist without both. What happened there was not just violence. It was erasure. And erasure leaves two kinds of ghosts, the ones we fear and the ones we become when we stop telling the truth. Listen again to the wind through those Florida pines. You might think it's just the breeze, but some say, if you listen close enough, you can still hear the rhythm of a hammer and a faint voice saying, "Hold the light. Hold it. Don't let it fade." It began, as many tragedies do, with a sound no one could quite place. A scream, carried by the wind from Sumner. Or maybe just a dog howling through the woods. But by the time it reached Rosewood, it had already changed shape. Someone had said a woman's been attacked. Someone else whispered a black man did it. And in the space between those two sentences, the air turned electric. It was January 1st, 1923, a Monday. The church bell had rung the day before for Sunday service. Now it sat quiet, its rope swaying slightly in the breeze, like a heartbeat, waiting for the next pulse. In Sumner, white men gathered outside the general store, coats, unbuttoned rifles, leaning against wagon wheels. They weren't sure what they were looking for, but they were sure of what they wanted. By evening, a name spread through the crowd: Jesse Hunter, a black man who had escaped a nearby chain gang. By midnight, that name became Sylvester Carrier. Rumor travels faster than truth, and rumor always finds a face. Back in Rosewood, the Carriers were sitting down to supper. Sarah stirred stew over the fire, humming a hymn. Sylvester sat by the window, the lantern lit, polishing his violin. He was known for two things, his temper and his music. Both came from the same place, the need to make noise in a world that tried to silence him. He had heard the rumors, the talk of Sumner, the men with guns, the train whistles sounding too long. He had heard them before, but this time the air felt different. Thick, heavy, the kind of quiet that presses against your chest. By dawn, the first wagon rolled down the dirt road toward Rosewood. 6 men, rifles, stacked eyes fixed ahead. They said they only wanted to ask questions. They said they just needed to look around. But questions asked with rifles are never meant to be answered. Sylvester told his mother to take the children to the woods. He placed the lantern in the window, its glass freshly cleaned as if a small light could hold back the storm. By noon, the mob doubled. By nightfall, it was 100 strong. Men on horseback, men with torches, men with fear dressed up as duty. They came first to Sam Carter's house. Sam was the town's blacksmith, strong kind, the kind of man who fixed anyone's wagon, no matter the color of their hands. He stepped out, holding a hammer. Not as a weapon, just a reflex. Someone shouted. A gun fired. And before the echo faded, Sam Carter fell into the dirt. The hammer rolled from his hand, one last spark catching the edge of the torchlight. Back in Rosewood, the church bell rang once. Not a call for worship, a warning. Sarah Carrier gathered the women inside. She told them to stay low, keep the children quiet. She prayed. Not for safety, but for mercy. Sylvester stayed by the door, rifle in hand. He had seen this before in stories, in letters, in nightmares passed down from generations. He knew how mobs moved, how fear smelled, how easily a rumor could turn into fire. Outside, the first torch touched the church fence. A hiss, a crackle, then the slow bloom of flame. The sound of wood surrendering to heat, a sound too familiar in the American South. Smoke rose over the pines. The bell swung once more, then fell. Metal on dirt, a sound so final that even the night paused. From the forest line, a few children saw the glow. They thought it was dawn coming early. They didn't yet understand that sometimes light means danger. The men of Rosewood, what few could bear arms, stood their ground. Shots echoed through the trees. Muzzle flashes blinked like lightning bugs in the dark. It wasn't a battle, it was a last stand no one had prepared for. Sylvester's last words, according to his niece, were quiet, almost a whisper. Get to the train. Don't wait for the light. But the train, the Seaboard airline that passed twice a day, didn't stop that night. The conductor saw the glow from miles away. He thought it was a brush fire. He blew the whistle 3 times, long, low, mournful, and kept going. That sound, that whistle, became part of the legend. They said the souls of Rosewood rode that sound, clinging to it, as the only thing that still moved in a world gone still. By morning, the mob spread like a tide. They went door to door. Names shouted, fires lit, windows shattered. Dogs barked until they didn't. Voices rose, then disappeared. And then, silence. Thick, choking silence. The survivors hid in the swamp. Children covered in soot and moss. Women carrying nothing but the clothes they wore and the memories they couldn't bear. They stayed there for days, drinking from puddles, listening for footsteps that never came close enough to see. The white sand road that led into Rosewood became a scar, blackened, twisted, lined with cinders. No one walked it for years. Those who came back later, the ones who dared, said the air smelled different. Not like smoke, not like pine. Something in between. Something that stayed. Years later, one survivor said in an interview, "We thought we was free. But that night showed us freedom can burn too." It's hard to say when the fire ended. Some say it burned 3 days. Others say the light in the woods lasted a week. But every version agrees on one thing: the church went first. And after the church fell, everything else followed. When the embers cooled, Rosewood was no longer a town. It was a memory waiting to be buried. The newspapers moved on. The county wrote no report. The governor called for calm and then for silence. And silence is a strange kind of burial. It doesn't use dirt or stone, it uses forgetting. But the people who escaped carried Rosewood with them, in songs, in scars, in the way they flinched at the sound of a train. One woman said she could still hear the church bell in her dreams, the single strike before the fire. "It's how I know I'm dreaming," she said. "Because when I wake up, it stops." That bell, that sound, became the heartbeat of a legend. In towns nearby, children dared each other to walk the old road after dark and listen. Some said you could still hear footsteps pacing behind you. Others said if you called out a name, the wind would answer. Fact or folklore, it doesn't matter. Both remember what the world tried to forget. And so, every January, when the pine trees whisper under the cold moonlight, the story of Rosewood wakes again. Somewhere in the dark, a lantern flickers, a train whistle echoes through the swamp, and the earth itself seems to breathe, waiting for someone, anyone, to listen. The fire went out, but the smoke it never really left. For 70 years, Rosewood lived only in whispers, in half-remembered stories, in the quiet spaces between family dinners where someone would pause before saying too much. The newspapers stopped printing its name after a week. The county sealed what little remained of its files. And Florida moved on, building new roads, new railways, new towns over the same soil that once held Rosewood's bones. But history, real history, has a way of bleeding through the cracks. In 1982, a young journalist named Gary Moore drove down Route 24, following a rumor he'd heard from a retired schoolteacher. She told him, "There was a town there once. They burned it down. No maps marked it. No road signs named it. Just a clearing, overgrown, silent, the kind of place where the wind carries too many stories." Moore began to dig, not in the dirt, but in the archives. He found a telegram dated January 6, 1923. Governor, violence spreading in Levy County, request assistance. Sheriff unable to control mob. The message had never been answered. He found property deeds signed in 1924, transferring dozens of acres, once belonging to black families, to white speculators, for as little as $1 each. He found census rolls, names crossed out, replaced with a single word, gone. And the deeper he looked, the more the silence screamed. His article, Rosewood, the town that died, published in the St. Petersburg Times, cracked open what had been buried for generations. Survivors came forward. Children who had escaped through the swamps, elders who had kept their mouths closed for 70 years, finally spoke. Their voices shook, but they spoke. One of them, Arnett Goen, said, "We was hiding in the palmettos. I could hear them shouting. I could smell the smoke." Mama said, "Close your eyes and pray." I did. When I opened them, the house was gone. Another Roby Morton, by then nearly 100 years old, said, "They told us never to come back. But I still go, in my dreams. I see the light in the window." It was those testimonies, fragile, trembling, and undeniable, that forced the state of Florida to look again. For the first time, the ghosts of Rosewood had names, faces, and proof. The official report, completed in 1993, ran more than 100 pages. It confirmed what folklore had carried all along, that the violence had been one-sided, that no black residents had been charged, and that nearly every home and business in Rosewood had been deliberately destroyed. The report cited racial hysteria, false accusation, mass violence unchecked. But between the bureaucratic lines, there was something else. A kind of guilt too heavy for paper. One paragraph reads, "There was no attempt to record the dead. Local authorities made no arrests. Survivors were advised to remain silent for their own safety." 70 years of silence, written down at last. And yet, for every fact uncovered, a dozen new questions appeared. Who fired the first shot? How many were buried in the pine woods? Why did no one return? Why did the train not stop? The report could not answer those. But the folklore never stopped trying. In Levy County, old-timers still tell a story about a man who built a cabin near the old Rosewood site in the 1950s. He said the nights there felt too still, that sometimes his lantern would flicker even when there was no wind. One night he claimed he woke to find the lantern lit, on its own swaying slightly as if carried by a hand he couldn't see. He left the next morning, never came back. Others said they heard the church bell. Not the whole ring, just one note. Low, distant, like the sound of metal remembering it once had a voice. A few of the surviving families began to hold small gatherings every January. They met under the pine trees near where the church once stood. No sign marked the spot, just a patch of ground that stayed bare even when the rest of the forest bloomed. They prayed. They sang. They told stories. One of the songs began quietly, almost a whisper. Hold the light. Don't let it fade. Hold the light. Through fire and shade. It was the same song that had passed down for decades through churches and kitchens, through generations who didn't know its origin, only its ache. Those gatherings, those humble ceremonies, became living archives. They preserved what the state could not. They honored what the records refused to name. But folklore does more than remember, it transforms. Somewhere in the late 20th century, a legend began to spread across Florida's backroads. Truckers called it the Lantern Man. They said if you drove Route 24 after midnight, you might see a glow between the trees, not bright but steady, keeping pace with your headlights. Some said it was the spirit of Sylvester Carrier. Still guarding the road, he died defending. Others said it was a warning that if you saw it, you should slow down, lower your lights, and whisper the word peace. For many it was superstition. For others, a form of respect, because in a world where truth had been denied, folklore became its own kind of justice. And maybe that's why even after the state finally acknowledged what happened, even after Florida passed the Rosewood Compensation Bill in 1994, offering restitution to survivors and their descendants, the stories didn't stop. They grew. They evolved. They took root in the collective conscience of a nation still struggling to face itself. The law gave numbers $2.1 million in reparations, 8 surviving claimants a memorial marker by the highway. But the folklore gave meaning away for the dead to keep speaking. In interviews recorded for the state archives, several descendants mentioned dreams, vivid, recurring. One said she dreamed of her great-grandfather walking through the woods carrying a hammer and a lantern. He would set the lantern down, nod once, and disappear. When she woke, the smell of smoke lingered in her room, faint but real. Another man who had never visited the site said he once drove through Levy County and felt an overwhelming urge to stop the car. He stepped out and heard faintly a rhythm like a hammer tapping wood. He wept without knowing why. Science calls it suggestion, collective memory, echoing trauma. But in the language of the people who lived it, it's presence. It's the way the past breathes through the cracks of now. And sometimes that breath becomes visible, like mist, like light, like a story refusing to die. Even the soil carries memory. A team of archaeologists once examined the site where the church had stood. They found layers of ash beneath new roots, small fragments of glass melted into the dirt as if time itself had tried to fuse the evidence shut. But under those layers, they found something else. The faint outline of a foundation, perfectly square, undisturbed. Like the ground had been holding it, keeping it safe. One of them said quietly, "It's as if the earth remembers better than we do." And maybe it does. Maybe that's why when storms pass through Levy County, lightning always seems to strike near that clearing, never on it. Maybe that's why on certain nights even the crickets fall silent. Rosewood, it seems, never left. It simply changed form from a town of wood and people to a town of memory and myth. When historians write about it now, they speak of racial violence, mob hysteria, state negligence. But when elders tell it, their voices soften. They say the light went out, but not all the way. And that difference, that space between record and reverence, is where the truth lives. Because Rosewood is not just a tragedy. It is a mirror showing how a country can forget, and then remember, and then pretend forgetting was never the crime. In 1995, when survivors gathered for the first public commemoration, they lit lanterns, dozens of them, and placed them along the old road. Each flame danced in the wind, trembling but unbroken. Children carried them, faces glowing, eyes wide, as they listened to elders speak. One woman stepped forward, Minnie Lee Langley, one of the last living survivors, and said softly, "I thought I'd never see this day. But the Lord kept me. And the light kept me." The crowd fell silent. Not the silence of ignorance, but the silence of recognition. The kind of silence that says, "We hear you now." And in that moment, under the dark Florida sky, the line between history and folklore blurred completely. The lanterns flickered, dozens of tiny suns reflecting off the tears of descendants who had come from across the country. No one spoke for a long while. Then from somewhere near the trees, a single voice began to hum the old song, "Hold the light, don't let it fade." And others joined, soft, trembling, imperfect, but together. Because that's what Rosewood had always been, a collection of voices, fragile and fierce, holding the light against the dark. Even now, a century later, the legend continues. Students visit the site each year, historians lecture, descendants tell their stories on camera. But some things can't be recorded, only felt. The way the air thickens when you stand in that clearing. The way your breath catches when you whisper the name Sylvester. The way just before dusk, the wind seems to carry a faint glow through the trees. Maybe it's nothing, maybe it's everything. What matters is this: the light still moves. And somewhere beyond paper, beyond apology, that carpenter's lantern still burns, not to haunt, but to guide. A reminder that even in a country built on forgetting, memory always finds its way home. There comes a moment, in every buried story, when the silence can no longer hold. It cracks softly at first, then all at once. For Rosewood, that moment came 70 years too late. But when it came, it was like the sound of a long-buried bell finally finding its echo. January 1994. Florida's winter air hung cool and clean over Tallahassee. Inside the state capitol, the House chambers filled with the sound of pages turning, voices murmuring, cameras whirring. For the first time in American history, a state government was about to pay restitution for a racial massacre it had once refused to name. Elderly survivors, some in wheelchairs, some leaning on canes, sat beneath the marble dome. They looked small under all that architecture. But the light from the windows fell directly on them, as if history itself had waited to illuminate their faces. One woman, Minnie Lee Langley, 99 years old, clutched a handkerchief embroidered with roses. Next to her, descendants of the Carrier and Goins families held framed photos, faces of men and women, long-gone faces that had never seen justice. When the vote came, the chamber fell silent. Then, eyes have it, and just like that, 70 years of denial folded into one trembling truth. Tears came not of triumph, but release. Because sometimes acknowledgement is heavier than forgetting. But even in that moment, even in that bright room filled with applause and relief, something deeper moved beneath the surface. A realization that this was not just Rosewood's story, it was America's. The report that led to that vote listed other towns, other fires, other names that history had tried to erase. Tulsa, 1921. Ocoee, 1920. Elaine, 1919. Different dates, different soil, same smoke. Each story carried the same rhythm. Prosperity, rumor, fire, silence. Each one whispered the same refrain: they forgot us. But memory has a strange way of linking the forgotten. When the Rosewood hearings began, researchers found letters from Tulsa survivors, handwritten notes offering support, sharing fragments of their own trauma. One read, "Tell them about us too. Tell them it happened more than once." And so, in that moment, Rosewood stopped being a single tragedy and became a map. A constellation of erasures, now burning bright again. The historians called it The geography of silence. From Arkansas to Florida, from Mississippi to Oklahoma, the same pattern repeated. A black community builds, thrives, hopes. A spark, rumor, lie, accusation ignites. A mob gathers. A town burns. And then, the ledger closes. No arrests, no graves. Just dust and the hum of a country moving on. But there is one thing you cannot burn: the instinct to remember. In the years after the Rosewood settlement, a new generation began to retrace the path. Students, filmmakers, journalists carrying microphones instead of torches. They walked the old roads, stood where the church had been interviewed, the last remaining witnesses. One of them, a young historian named Dr. Marvin Dunn, said, "When I stand here, I can feel the story pushing back against the soil. The ground doesn't like to lie." He found artifacts, pieces of pottery glass shards, a child's marble scorched on one side. He found names in the census books that matched none of the official death counts. He found that the absence of records was the record. And each discovery, each document, each whisper stitched the fabric of truth tighter. But the climax of this story isn't the finding, it's the reckoning. Because once the truth returns, what do we do with it? The descendants of the mob. The grandchildren of those who watched and stayed silent. They too came to the site. Some came to apologize. Others came to understand. A few simply stood in the clearing, heads bowed, unsure what to say to ghosts that shared their bloodline. One woman, a teacher from Gainesville, whispered, "My grandfather was there. He never talked about it. I came to listen." And that act of listening became the truest form of repentance. Across the state, the Rosewood story began appearing in classrooms, first as a footnote, then as a full chapter. In documentaries, it became a symbol, a lantern in the dark corners of the American past. But every time the story was told, the folklore rose alongside it, inseparable, breathing, alive. During one of the commemorations, a young boy no older than 10 pointed toward the tree line and said quietly, "Mama, look, there's a light." No one saw it at first. Then others did a faint golden shimmer, moving slowly through the trees, hovering just above the ground. The crowd grew silent. No flashlights, no tricks. Just that soft glow drifting, then fading, then gone. Some smiled, some cried, some crossed themselves. Was it reflection, coincidence, the way dusk plays tricks on eyes? Or was it something older, the story reminding everyone that it's still here? Folklore doesn't need proof, it just needs witnesses. And on that night, the anniversary of the fire, there were hundreds. As darkness settled, the elders began to hum the same melody passed down through generations. Hold the light, don't let it fade. Voices joined one by one, until the clearing trembled with sound. A drone camera captured the moment from above, lanterns glowing in a circle. The crowd illuminated like an island of warmth in a sea of black forest. To anyone watching from afar, it might have looked like ritual. To those standing there, it felt like resurrection. Because that night, for the first time in a century, Rosewood was not a story of loss. It was a story of return. The climax wasn't vengeance, it was visibility. From the ashes rose a new narrative, one that refused to end in despair. One that said, "We are still here, still singing, still remembering, still holding the light." And that's what makes Rosewood more than a tragedy. It's a compass. It points to every buried truth waiting to be uncovered. Every voice still caught in the undertow of history. In one interview, a descendant said something that lingers still. "I used to think the ghosts wanted revenge. But now I know they just wanted to be found." Those words, quiet, almost trembling, carry the essence of the climax. Because the ghosts of Rosewood were never meant to scare. They were meant to guide us back to the facts, back to the names, back to the places we built and lost. And as the camera pans over the pine forest, mist rolling, crickets humming, the narration lowers to a whisper. Every nation has its ghosts. Ours just happen to carry lanterns. Fade to black. Then a single line on screen. Rosewood, Florida, 1923. The town that was erased. And the truth that refused to die. But even as the screen fades, the voice remains steady, human, reflective. If you ever drive through Levy County at night and you see a light moving through the trees, slow down. Don't fear it. That's just the past, trying to find its way home. They say the land never forgets. And maybe that's why a century later you can still feel it breathing. Walk the old road at dawn, the one lined with pines so tall they seem to scrape the clouds, and listen. The air hums not with cars, not with people, but with something deeper. A vibration beneath the earth, like a sigh that never found rest. That's Rosewood, still whispering. After the settlement, after the apologies, the documentaries, the ceremonies, the world moved on again. That's what the world does. It moves, even when hearts stay still. But some stories don't end when the credits roll. They linger the way smoke does after fire. You can't see it anymore, but you can smell it, taste it, sense it somewhere just behind you. For years, descendants came back quietly, one by one, to stand in that clearing. They brought photographs, bits of brick from family homes, jars of soil from the churchyard. They came not to mourn, but to speak names aloud, names that had been erased from ledgers, but not from memory. They spoke them like prayers. They spoke them like defiance. And the forest listened. Because when names are spoken, forgetting becomes impossible. There's an old belief older than this country that the dead are only truly gone when the living stop calling their names. If that's true, then Rosewood never died. It just went quiet, until someone finally called it back. You can hear that calling now in classrooms, in songs, in the steady murmur of documentaries like this one. Each retelling a heartbeat, each voiceover another pulse. And maybe that's the real legacy, not the fire, not the fear, but the insistence on being remembered. Every January, the families return again to light candles, to hum the old hymn. The children run through the grass, chasing the flicker of flame, laughing. Not because they don't know what happened, but because they do. And they're still here. Laughter in Rosewood is an act of rebellion. So is joy. So is survival. The elders stand together, shoulders touching, humming softly. Hold the light. Don't let it fade. That refrain travels through the trees, across generations, through speakers and screens to you. Right now. Wherever you are. Because that's the thing about history. It isn't locked in the past. It breathes through whoever listens. Some say the ghost light still appears faint golden, drifting near the tree line. Others say it's only imagination. But every January, without fail, the lantern glow returns, and no one can explain it. A few years ago, a group of students camped near the site for a documentary project. At 2 a.m., one of them woke to find a glow between the pines. He thought it was another student filming, but when he stepped closer, the light moved away, slow and steady. He whispered, "Hello?" The light paused as if listening, then faded. When he told the story later, his professor smiled and said, "Maybe the past was checking to see if you were listening. And maybe that's all the past ever wanted. To be heard, to be seen, to be acknowledged not as myth, but as memory. Because denial is a second death. And telling this story is a resurrection. In the years since the Rosewood site has changed, there's a highway marker now, green and gold, standing tall by the road. It reads, "In memory of the community of Rosewood destroyed in the violence of January 1923. Cars pass it every day. Most don't stop. Some slow down just long enough to wonder what happened here. A few pull over, step out, stand in the quiet, and listen. If they stay long enough, the forest begins to speak. The wind sounds like voices. The crickets hum like hymns. And sometimes, just sometimes, the air smells faintly of cedar and smoke. It's said that trauma can live in the soil, that every root, every drop of water carries traces of memory. If that's true, then the roots of Rosewood stretch far beyond Florida. They wind through every forgotten black town, every erased community, every field where a name was never written down. Rosewood isn't just a place, it's a pattern. It's the echo of Greenwood in Tulsa, of Ocoee, of Elaine, of every place where prosperity became a threat and black success became a target. But in each of those stories, there's also a counterweight, the will to remember, the light that refuses to die. And so even after all this time, the story returns, like the tide, like a breath taken again after being held too long. Maybe that's why even today, filmmakers still chase it. Writers still trace it, descendants still guard it. Because somewhere deep down, we all know history unspoken becomes history repeated. And perhaps that's the lesson Rosewood leaves us with. That healing doesn't begin with forgetting. It begins with telling. Telling the truth, telling it again and again, until the silence breaks for good. If you listen now, really listen, you can still hear it. A hammer striking softly in the distance, a bell faint but steady, a hymn half-remembered floating through the trees. Hold the light. The voiceover lowers almost to a whisper. They thought they buried a town. But they only planted a story, and stories, they grow. They reach toward light no matter how deep they were buried. Today in classrooms across America, children learn the name Rosewood, not as tragedy alone, but as truth restored. They see the photos, hear the recordings, feel the tremor in the voices of survivors. They ask questions. They don't look away. And in that simple act, history breathes again. Because every generation that listens becomes another lantern, another point of light in the long, dark forest. The final shot fades in dawn breaking over the pine canopy, light piercing through fog, birds calling the first sounds of morning. The narration pauses, a long, still silence then. If you ever find yourself driving this road, slow down. Look to your right. You may not see the town, but the land remembers. And if you listen, really listen, you might just hear a hammer, a hymn, and a mother's voice saying, "Run, baby. Don't look back." Fade to black. One last breath. The light stayed.